Security Administration 20 years after 9/11. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Good morning. I want to thank TSA Administrator David Patoski, as well as former administrators Peter Neffinger, John Pistol, and James Lloyd for being with us today and for their leadership in safeguarding our nation. And let me say that we've never had assembled before this committee such an august group of individuals who've done so much to keep us as a nation safe 20 years in. So I'm looking forward to their testimony. 20 years ago, the morning of September 11th, the United States suffered the most devastating targeted attack in history. Thousands of lives were lost and many more was changed forever. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, the federal government engaged in a massive effort to reshape our security efforts and respond to new global threats. Most importantly, for today's hearing, it was clear that federal authorities needed to be responsible for safeguarding our nation's transportation system, and so Transportation Security Administration was born. In its 20-year history, TSA has had 7 Senate-confirmed administrators. 4 of them are with us today. Together, they represent the majority of the history of TSA, and they can speak to the incredible changes and growth the agency has undergone in the past 2 decades. When TSA began amid an uncertain threat picture, a rapid response required a one-size-fits-all approach to security measures, primarily using simple metal detectors and X-ray machines. Over the years, TSA has responded to evolving threats, evolving terrorist tactics to advance its approach to screening and vetting. Today, TSA utilizes modern technologies such as advanced imaging technology and computer tomography machines to detect a range of non-metallic weapons. TSA has developed a sophisticated, risk-based security approach and leveraged intelligence, passenger vetting, and trusted traveler programs to focus limited resources on the most pressing threats. TSA must continue to evolve because we continually face new kinds of threats. Today, threats are arising not just from violent terrorist groups, but from lone wolf actors, cyber criminals, public health emergencies, and unruly passengers. We've also seen threats expand from a focus on passenger aircraft to include other transportation modes and assets, such as air cargo, mass transit, freight, and passenger rail, and pipelines. Collectively, these threats challenge the limits of TSA's authorities and resources, and Congress must ensure TSA remains prepared to execute its critical security mission. I'm eager to hear about the changes TSA has undergone to meet those threats and allow Americans to travel securely throughout the ongoing global pandemic. Unfortunately, even with all the modern improvements TSA has made, some issues have remained stagnant. The agency has struggled throughout its history to create a well-compensated, empowered, and fulfilled workforce. I'm happy to see the Biden administration taking steps to improve the situation. On Monday, Administrator Patoski announced a new memorandum of agreement with the Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB, under which the MSPB has agreed to review adverse action appeals from frontline officers. This action responds to longstanding calls for a fair third-party disciplinary appeals process for the TSA workforce. I commend Administrator Patoski, Secretary Mayorkas, and the Biden administration for taking this important step. Still, a change in the law and significant funding will be needed to provide TSA workers with the workplace rights and the competitive pay they deserve. To that end, I look forward to continuing to advance my bill, the Rights for TSA Workforce Act of 2021, with which this committee marked up in July. Before I close, I'd also note, as chairman, I strive to bring diverse witness panels before the committee. Although there have been some diversity among TSA's leadership over the years, only white male administrators have ever been confirmed by the Senate to lead the Transportation Security Administration. I hope TSA will increase the diversity of its leadership, both for its workforce as well as the American people. As we look ahead, the successes as well as the missteps of the past 2 decades will help guide our mission to provide Americans with a safe, efficient, and secure transportation system. I look forward to reflecting on those issues today. Before I recognize the ranking member, and without objection, I include in the record a statement from the American Federation of Government Employees on the subject of today's hearing. Again, I thank our witnesses for joining us and for their honorable and steadfast service to our nation. With that, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing today. I appreciate it. As you well know, I started out as a subcommittee chair for TSA on Homeland Security, so this is a topic that's always near and dear to my heart. On September 11, 2001, 19 hijackers proceeded through U.S. airport security and, once on board, commandeered 4 commercial aircraft, flying them into the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon, and a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. 2 of the people that were flight attendants on the American Airlines flight that crashed into the World Trade Center were friends of mine. The Transportation Security Administration was created in the months after this terrorist attack and made dramatic changes to our travel landscape. Gone are the days when you could arrive for a flight minutes before takeoff or meet your arriving family members at the gate. But with the immense help of the private sector, TSA quickly stood up and established a robust aviation screening system, and our nation is truly grateful. Over the past 20 years, TSA has continuously adapted their screening procedures based on critical intelligence and risk, while also expanding its focus on securing surface transportation. This is exactly the type of elasticity that the Homeland Security Committee in the wake of 9/11 envisioned. When our committee was in New York recently at the 9/11 Museum, a memorial for the 20th anniversary of that terrible day in our nation's history, we all reflected on the nearly 3,000 Americans that died on 9/11. We didn't believe it was possible at the time, but TSA and the Department of Homeland Security have been very successful in preventing a significant 9/11 style attack on our transportation system over the last 20 years. That's an amazing feat, and I want to keep it that way for the next 20 years. I know all the members of the committee feel the same way. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter written testimonies from former Secretary Chertoff and former Administrator Hawley into the record. We appreciate their service as well as the service of the esteemed panelists who are here before the committee today.
Without objection.
Thank you. It is impressive that we will hear from 4 of the 7 Senate-confirmed TSA administrators. I'm going to thank all of you for all you have done and continue to do in keeping our country secure. As we approach TSA's 20th anniversary on November 19th, it is imperative that we now turn our attention to how TSA should be positioned to counter new and emerging threats we couldn't conceive of in the early days after 9/11. I'm extremely concerned that our withdrawal from Afghanistan will create a new safe haven for terrorists. Our homeland is again at risk with the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in that region, where they now once again have found a comfortable home. As terrorist threats continue to evolve, TSA needs to accelerate its deployment of next generation technology and biometrics to the checkpoint. And we cannot delay these investments or accept movement at a snail's pace, lest we risk being caught flat-footed once again. These needed technologies include credential authentication technology, computed tomography, advanced imaging technology, standoff detection, and so much more. TSA must be agile and ensure that its workforce is positioned to counter the evolving threats we will see over the next 20 years. As former Administrator Kip Hawley said in his statement for the record, quote, "Intelligence and technology are critical to effective security, but people were and still are TSA's strongest asset," end quote. I wholeheartedly agree, and I thank the employees of TSA for their service to securing the nation's transportation systems. Their dedication has shown through as they have continued to perform their critical duties in the midst of a global pandemic. Over 10,000 TSA employees have tested positive for COVID-19, and 29 have tragically died. I've spoken to Administrator Patoski, my friend, regularly regarding my concern that the frontline TSA workforce is not paid enough, and I know he shares that concern. Transportation security officers have an important job and their pay does not reflect it. I've heard time and again that the pay issues are going to be fixed, but they never are. I look forward to hearing from Administrator Patoski today on the details of the compensation he is providing to the frontline workforce and what Congress can do to support these pay initiatives. As we reflect on the past 20 years of TSA and its 20 years going forward, we must remember one thing. We must never, ever forget. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is the Honorable David Patoski, the current administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, a position he's held since 2017. In his role, he's responsible for overseeing the execution of TSA's mission to secure the nation's transportation system and lead TSA's workforce of more than 60,000 employees. Prior to his time as TSA administrator, he spent 33 years in the U.S. Coast Guard, where he became the service's 26th Vice Commandant in 2009. In addition, Mr. Patoski was selected earlier this year by President Biden to be the acting Secretary of Homeland Security ahead of Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas' confirmation. I appreciate his willingness to appear on this panel with former TSA administrators. Our next witness is the Honorable Peter Neffinger, who was TSA administrator from 2015 to 2017 and is a retired Vice Admiral in the U.S. Coast Guard. Under his leadership, TSA developed its use of automated screening technology, examined airport public area security, and cultivated TSA's relationship with industry to resolve long checkpoint delays at airports across the country. Vice Admiral Neffinger is a 34-year veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, where he served as the 29th Vice Commandant before being nominated by President Barack Obama to be TSA Administrator. Our third witness is the Honorable John S. Pistol, the TSA Administrator from 2010 to 2014. He's the president of Anderson University, his alma mater, in Anderson, Indiana. During his tenure at TSA, Mr. Pistol oversaw the creation of the pre-check program and was the first administrator to grant TSA workforce limited collective bargaining rights. Prior to his position as administrator, Mr. Pistol spent 26 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he led the Counterterrorism Division following the attacks of 9/11. In October 2004, he rose to the position of Deputy Director of the FBI. Our fourth witness, the Honorable James M. Lloyd, was the second TSA administrator, serving from 2002 to 2003. He came to TSA from his position as Commandant of the Coast Guard, the role he was in on the day of the 9/11 attacks. As one of the earliest leaders of TSA, he oversaw the launch of many of TSA's operational activities and the hiring of tens of thousands of newly minted TSA employees. He later served as the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush, capping off a career in public service spanning more than 4 decades. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask Administrator Patoski to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for holding this morning's hearing and for your comments in your opening statements. I appreciate the opportunity to appear with three distinguished former administrators of TSA. They each continue to make substantial contributions to our country, and they are all friends and colleagues. It has been my honor to build on the foundation they established during their time leading TSA. Each year, we remember the 9/11 attacks and the 2,977 people who perished. In our remembrance this year at TSA headquarters and at airports around the country, our theme was United in Memory, Together in Mission. I, like many of you, remember that day as if it were yesterday. And in addition to witnessing in horror the terrorist attacks carried out in our homeland, I remember the way it felt to watch our country unite behind a shared experience and together commit to never forget and never again. Our motto in TSA is not on my watch. In living this motto, we must ensure that unity of effort and unity of purpose, so evident immediately following 9/11, continue to endure. Approximately 2 months following 9/11, Congress passed the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, establishing TSA. In that legislation, and in our first major reauthorization just 3 years ago, you have provided us with the authorities needed to protect the nation's transportation systems. The theme of this morning's hearing is the state of TSA 20 years after 9/11. In assessing the state of TSA, I would respectfully submit that the state of TSA is very strong. We continue to accomplish our mission in the face of threats to our transportation system, both aviation and surface. And we are achieving our vision to be an agile security agency embodied by a professional workforce that engages its partners in the American people to outmatch a dynamic threat. I'd like to briefly highlight 3 elements of this success: agility, partnerships, and our people that are particularly relevant to this hearing. First, agility. The intelligence community's work in assessing threats has allowed us to mitigate risk to aviation and surface transportation. We have rapidly changed our procedures in domestic airports and at last point of departure international airports based on intelligence community assessments and share this information rapidly as appropriate with our partners. Thanks to your support, we are in the midst of a major upgrade to the technology in our screening checkpoints at over 400 airports around the country. These upgrades include improved passenger identity verification and screening through the use of credential authentication technology, improved carry-on bag screening using computed tomography or CT X-ray technology, and soon, improved on-person screening through upgraded advanced imaging technology. The net result of all these advancements is twofold: significantly enhanced security effectiveness and an improved passenger experience. I thank you for your support of these technology improvements. They are critical to our continued success. Additionally, exercising the agility you provided in law, we have recently issued security directives to improve cybersecurity at our nation's most critical gas and hazardous liquid pipelines, and we plan to expand this cybersecurity effort to include all critical transportation security infrastructure. The second key element of success is partnerships. We have outstanding partnerships with other federal agencies, as well as our partners in state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Similarly, we work very closely with our international partners to ensure global aviation security, especially at last point of departure airports. I appreciate your support of our one-stop security efforts to enable us to pilot security equivalency at select international locations. This will improve aviation security. I am very proud of the partnerships we have with the aviation and surface transportation owners and operators. This model of engagement has allowed us to improve security at a pace and level of sophistication that would not otherwise be possible. And with that, the security and convenience benefits to passengers who use these systems every day. Without question, a key element of our success is our people. And I couldn't be prouder of the people who serve their country in TSA. They professionally ensure secure travel to millions of people every single day. I have worked tirelessly to earn their trust and provide the support and guidance they need to accomplish our critical mission. I continue to strongly support adjustments to pay for all of our people, especially our frontline workers. Regarding our screening workforce in particular, I would add 2 additional comments. We have already transitioned to adverse action appeals to the Merit Systems Protection Board, and very shortly I will sign a new directive providing full collective bargaining rights. In conclusion, we are united in memory, together in mission. I thank each member of this committee for your support of TSA and the opportunity to testify this morning, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now ask Admiral Neffen to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you, Ranking Member Katko, and the distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to join my distinguished colleagues and my good friends in recognizing the 20th anniversary of the TSA and to reflect upon what is the unique value and critically important service it provides to our nation. Transportation underpins our economic health, is central to our prosperity and resilience, and is a key component of our national security. And one of the greatest privileges of my career was to have served with the women and men of the TSA. They are among the most dedicated, professional, and selfless public servants I've known, and our nation is safer and more secure because of their work, and I remain grateful for their service. TSA's missions encompass the full spectrum of our nation's transportation system: aviation, maritime, mass transit, passenger and freight rail, over-the-road motor carriers, interstate pipelines, and more. It is an extraordinarily dynamic and complex mission set, made even more so by a continually evolving and expanding threat environment. And transportation security today is a direct outgrowth, as we've heard, of the tragic attacks of September 11th, the 20th anniversary of which we sadly commemorated this month. Transportation was the weapon of 9/11, and it offered the means and the instruments for terrorists to strike at America. This hearing has recounted the history of our nation's actions and successes since that tragic event, and has already highlighted TSA's many accomplishments. My colleagues will also describe in chilling detail the diverse array of new threats we face. Building upon this, I will add some thoughts looking forward. We are safer and more secure because of the security architecture we've built over the past 20 years. We've developed more capable systems and technologies. We've integrated and shared intelligence among many stakeholders. We've designed processes and procedures for vetting people who access or work in critical areas. And we've developed tactics and techniques to prevent large-scale attacks like 9/11 from happening again. We've become exceptionally adept at instituting countermeasures to the terrorist tactics we have seen and experienced. And such countermeasures are essential. Security is necessarily additive, as terrorists and criminals rarely remove a tool from their kit. However, today's security systems, as good as they are not sufficient for tomorrow's threats. Adversaries are agile, adaptive, aggressive, and creative. We have to be even more so. There is no perfect system, no ideal technology, and no we got it right moment. Success demands systems and technologies that are adaptive, innovative, and focused on imagining what might happen, in addition to protecting against what has happened. And that imagination is key. Terrorists and criminals are dangerous entrepreneurs, always seeking advantage and ever poised to exploit vulnerabilities. These include increasingly sophisticated interdependent cyber systems, the shocking lessons of the global COVID-19 pandemic, vulnerabilities presented by interconnected industrial control systems, and the growing sophistication and deployment of technologies such as unmanned systems and autonomous vehicles. Moreover, barriers to entry continue to lower, especially with respect to cyber. The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack and the hacking of a major U.S. maritime port just last week dramatically illustrate the ease with which critical infrastructure can be attacked and disabled by remote cyber actors. Administrator Patoski has presented a compelling strategy for investment in the TSA workforce, including increasing pay and evolving and modernizing TSA's systems and architecture. The TSA Innovation Task Force and the Office of Requirements and Capabilities Analysis are working hard to imagine future threats and innovate faster than our adversaries. But their work requires predictable, stable, and reliable funding and support to succeed. And I urge this committee and Congress to fully fund TSA's strategy to ensure they'll continue to evolve faster than the threats we envision. I also urge you to support efforts to mature research and development efforts across DHS to include robust private sector engagement and open architecture standards. Coordinated, ongoing, operationally focused, and integrated R&D is fundamental to countering future threats. Security is a never-ending race, and we need to stay in the lead. I thank this committee for your continued and steadfast support of the TSA over the years and for support of its dedicated workforce, and I look forward to your comments and any questions you may have. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Katko and distinguished members.
Thank you very much. I now ask Mr. Pistol to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, sir. And Ranking Member Katko, just a personal note, I happened to be in your district on 9/11 20 years ago doing an FBI audit and inspection. It was in the federal courthouse when the planes hit there. So, and also thank you to the rest of the members of the committee and to the professional staff who make this hearing possible. I just have 3 points I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Katko. First, I strongly encourage you and the administration to continue support for the broad authorities for the TSA administrator. which each of the other former administrators and current administrator Patoski have exercised judiciously. Just a couple of examples, one from a threat perspective and one from an innovation perspective that I experienced in my 4.5 years as the administrator. One, we're all well familiar with the October 2010 AQAP toner cartridge plot out of Yemen, where 2 toner cartridge bombs were being sent from Sana'a, Yemen to Chicago. That plot was foiled by just great intelligence. So it wasn't because of great screening. And that actually came from the White House, the Deputy National Security Advisor at the time, John Brennan, before he went to the CIA, working with the head of the Administrative Interior of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and then the chief counsel at both TSA and the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Security Operations and International Affairs, along with the FBI, CIA, and State Department, and of course, all those at DHS headquarters. I was able to issue emergency amendments, which literally barred any and all cargo from being shipped from Yemen to the US. Now, there are a number of ramification unintended consequences of that action, but it kept future bombs from being shipped to the US. Second, on the innovation aspect of the broad authorities, with the terrific senior leadership team that I inherited at TSA and great support from then Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano and CBP Commissioner Alan Burson, we envisioned and launched the TSA PreCheck program, which is, of course, now a popular trusted traveler program with nearly 11 million people enrolled. In addition to those who do dual enrollment from CBP's Global Entry Program, a hugely successful trusted traveler program for international travels. So thank you, Chairman Thompson and other members of the committee who had the foresight and in crafting the legislation initially, standing up TSA to provide those authorities, because it gave me the opportunity to take immediate action to mitigate, one, a clear and present danger, and then also to implement a risk-based security initiative to facilitate smooth, safe travel for millions of law-abiding citizens, and to move, as you said, Mr. Chairman, from a one-size-fits-all to risk-based security approaches. Secondly, I would encourage you and the entire committee to support the TSA workforce, as has been articulated by Administrator Patoski, especially the frontline TSOs. Better pay is the key issue, and I'm heartened by some of the efforts being made to improve the pay, whether that means moving the workforce to the GS pay system under Title V or other initiatives. I think that's an important thing to do. Let me just make a comment on the collective bargaining, since I was an administrator who issued that determination to allow for a modified form of collective bargaining. I think AFG, the union representing the TSOs, has done a good job of representing them in this unique, non-traditional collective bargaining agreement. Both the Chief Counsel of TSA, Francine Kerner, and the General Counsel for AFG, David Bohr, they are the 2 constants over the last 10 years since I issued the determination, who provided great legal advice, context, and clarity as moving forward. Then third is that I support and encourage what my 2 successors have done in terms of innovation, because we know innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it's really just a couple of points there: through investment in key technologies and processes, and then in partnerships, which the current administrator has mentioned. Partnerships with the private sector, so they are incentivized to do the R&D to deploy next-gen technology today, tomorrow, and for years to come. And so obviously partnerships with you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Katko and OMB, the manufacturers, the airlines, the airports, the associations, including A4A, AAAE, ACI, North America, Global Business Travel Association, Air Cargo, Rail Passengers, Railway Industry Association, Pipeline Association, and then the international partners such as IATA. Those are all critical to the success of TSA. And as we saw with the underwear bomber, Christmas Day 2009, and his non-metallic improvised explosive device, and the toner cartridge plot that I mentioned, terrorists are innovative and determined, so must we be. Spiral development is one thing, but breakthrough technology is even better. I had the opportunity to testify 3 times for the 9/11 Commission, and of course, one of the findings from that was that one of the shortcomings of the U.S. government writ large counterterrorism efforts prior to 9/11 was a, quote, failure of imagination. It is incumbent, I believe, on all of us to ensure that doesn't happen again. And then my last point, 3.5, is on cybersecurity, which has been mentioned. Same points as on innovation through investment, partnership, maximize the partnerships, evaluate, and repeat. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to take questions from you in the committee. Time.
Thank you very much. I now ask Admiral Lloyd to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Katko, and the members of the committee. I appreciate being included in your committee's look back and ongoing oversight of TSA. As the Commandant of the Coast Guard on 9/11/01, I joined millions of my fellow citizens as we watched the events of that day unfold. The Coast Guard organized and led the maritime boat lift in New York Harbor that evacuated over 500,000 people from Manhattan over the water to Staten Island, New Jersey. And that day remains for me and for all Americans sort of our generation's Pearl Harbor. I remember well the countless meetings that followed as we came to terms with the reality that the two great oceans no longer were going to provide any guarantee that America cannot be reached by those intent on doing us harm. The resultant legislation created first the TSA and then the Department of Homeland Security. Those pieces of legislation were announcements to the world that we had awakened to this new terrorism threat. The days that followed included the most significant and executive branch reorganization since 1947. Coordination with the Congress produced the TSA Act, outlining the establishment and shape of this new executive agency, where the FAA had heretofore been responsible for both safety and security of commercial aviation. The new law called for the security elements to be responsibility of the new TSA. Although centered on aviation, for obvious reasons, the law mandated that the new agency focus on all modes of transportation. The legislation provided the roadmap, and we then set about to establish the agency. It was probably the most gratifying yet challenging years of my 42 years of public service as we took that on. We recruited applicants for 60,000 positions at airports across the country. Those applicants were vetted, hired, trained, and distributed to over 400 airports in 9 weeks. We allowed the reality of the stand-up process to shape and evolve the agency, which has continued to date. We worked with all the major airlines, the trade associations, the appropriate government agencies, foreign advisors, commercial vendors to design and outfit the thousands of checkpoints that would provide that security, that physical security required by the law. And I'll never forget the night of December 31, 2003, when I was able to report to then Secretary Norman Netta that the airport on Guam had, quote, gone green, which was our vernacular for gaining operational compliance with the law. As in any endeavor of this magnitude, it required contributions from many to be accomplished well and on time. As is also the case with any such endeavor, changes were made in policy and practice as I and my successors in the administrator's chair led and managed the agency over the years, which you have already heard. Mr. Chairman, several things stand out to me as being deserving of the committee's ongoing attention. First, and it's been mentioned already, the adequacy of TSA's link to the intelligence community for threat analysis and for the evolution of what that threat means to the operating days and weeks of the agency itself. Secondly, adequate attention to all modes of transportation, not just aviation. It's clearly reasonable that we have focused on aviation over the years, but terrorist incidents, for example, in London in subway systems and Spain on rail systems, make those serious issues as well. And I appreciate the committee's ongoing attention to all modes of transportation, not just aviation. And then a constancy of focus on response and recovery, as well as preparedness and prevention planning for dealing with any scenario that would interrupt the transportation system. Mr. Chairman, we plank owners at TSA are enormously proud of our time standing up and leading the agency. We coined the motto, never forget, and just met together for the 20th annual ceremony remembering the events of 9/11/2001. The staff and employees all renewed their oath of commitment to remain vigilant in their quest to keep America secure. I take no comfort in the fact that 20 years have gone by without another 9/11. We have to remain vigilant and diligent and focus on today and tomorrow. And this hearing is, to me, a formal statement that about how important that relentless diligence is to keeping us safe going into the future. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
I thank the witnesses for that testimony. Obviously, your unique role within TSA speaks for itself. So I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for questions. TSA is a unique agency within government. No other agency interacts so intimately with such a broad swath of the public on a daily basis. All of us can remember Admiral Lloyd when we first started. Um, we were basically trying to put it together because we needed to do it. So the men and women did a wonderful job. We've come a long way as an agency. We've done the threat analysis, and the threats have changed from time to time. But what I'd like to do is go from um, our, our current administrator back to Admiral Lloyd to talk about what did you find most challenging during your tenure leading TSA? If you could point to that issue um, that you felt that that you just had to somehow address. And with our current administrator, I'm sure you could start us off with that.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I would say, the thing that I found most challenging is something we've already talked about this morning, and that is to ensure that we adequately compensate our workforce. I found no one disagrees with that at all. Everyone agrees. It's just finding the funding to be able to execute on that very important priority for all of us. And that's one of my very top priorities as the administrator. The other thing that I would mention from my 4 years plus now in this chair, one of the things that is very exciting about being the administrator of TSA, but really requires an awful lot of focus, is there are a lot of things that come up every single day. And there are a lot of priorities that any one of us would look at and say, we got to get that one done. We got to get that one done. And the challenge really and the opportunity is to establish those clear priorities so that we get a concrete set of actions in place. And the key here too, and my predecessors have already commented on this, is it is not just TSA acting alone. We have to act with our partners, because our partners are part and parcel of a successive security regime in this country. And so it's always providing that strategic direction to keep our focus on true north and to get the most important priorities done. But I would say, sir, the most challenging, and I hope to see some positive success on this over the course of the next several months, is on pay, particularly for our frontline workforce. Thank you.
Admiral Neffen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would certainly echo everything that Administrator Patoski just said. Getting adequate pay to the front line is critical and key. It's a very challenging and demanding job out there. And one of the things that really struck me when I came to TSA was how skilled those frontline TSOs are in that job. I think the average American citizen and the average traveler has no real appreciation for how much work it takes to be good at what they do out there. So let me echo that. And let me add, a couple of challenges that I saw. As you know, I was during my tenure was a time when we saw a dramatic and significant increase in the number of people traveling on a daily basis. We climbed over 2 million passengers a day on average, screening through TSA checkpoints, and that was in the face of some staff shortages and some other challenges that we had based upon DHS-IG findings that were inadvertently or leaked, classified report that was leaked to the public, and put TSA into a lot of crisis situation and demoralized the frontline workforce. So I would say one of the greatest challenges I faced was rebuilding confidence in the agency and rebuilding a sense of purpose to the frontline workforce that was unfortunately the brunt of most of the criticism that came out. As I said during that time, if there's criticism to be had, it's not the frontline workforce that deserved it. It was the people who led the agency that failed the frontline workforce. So I think it was, in my mind, that was one. It was one of the more gratifying aspects of my tenure as I watched that frontline workforce really regain its confidence and focus on getting good at what they did again. But that was a particularly challenging time, I think, for TSA, and I've been really proud of what they've accomplished since, and have continued to accomplish under the current administrator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Pistol?
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. I think when I arrived as administrator in the summer of 2010, part of it was to provide the opportunities to go from the one-size-fits-all to risk-based security using some common sense things. And then also helping professionalize the workforce in a way that they had not been afforded that opportunity previously by creating the TSA Academy down at FLETC, and then also creating, expanding on the Office of Workforce Engagement, and then the Office of Professional Responsibilities. So I'd come from the FBI, an agency that had been around more than 100 years, had time to really build some of that infrastructure to say, and systems and processes to say, here's how consistent, fair adjudication of misconduct or other things should be. And so I was given that opportunity, and with a great support from the department, from you and others on the Hill, and obviously from the workforce to say, yes, let's take these steps to help professionalize and provide that exceptional service that is expected for those 2 million plus passengers a day. So those are some of the challenges and highlights.
Admiral Lloyd?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think my recollection, in the stand-up process was the very simple recognition from those of us who were in the middle of the crucible, so to speak, recognizing that we didn't have a corner on the market of good ideas. We reached out, as you have defined, partnerships to so many different players, trade associations of commercial aviation and the land transportation elements of our country. I remember a personal association with Herb Kelleher, who was then the president of Southwest Airlines, a remarkably visionary kind of a guy, now passed, unfortunately. But it was his willingness as the CEO of a major airline to literally get in the work trenches with us to figure out the best ways to do what we needed to do next. So I think that notion of American citizens in lots of walks of life standing up and being willing to be counted and being willing to participate in the design of this new agency that was going to impact a large portion of their lives. And that included even international reach. I remember my colleagues at the Israeli Security Agency, well known for their already 40 years of focus on aviation security around the globe. They could not have been more deliberative. They allowed me to check very deeply into the way they did business in Israel. Those ideas that we were able to bring back and integrate into the design of the checkpoints, et cetera, were critical to our early stand-up process. And I think establishing standards lower than which we would never go with regard to mandating superior performance out of our new agency. So it's that partnership business and recognizing that we needed to open our doors and windows to new ideas and even established existing ideas that would help us establish this agency as well as we could possibly do it.
Thank you very much. Let me just say all four of you have talked about the workforce, how we need to make sure that we pay them adequately for the job that they're doing and give them the support as government employees they need. And a lot of us have pursued that for quite a while. And I look forward to working with the administrator currently to make that a reality and treat our TSOs like all other government employees are, and if that's giving them Title V rights, we should do that. Chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, gentleman from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see all of the witnesses today. It's been a while since I've seen you, Mr. Neffinger, and the others there. So I'm happy to have this moment to chat with you. I don't have a question on the employee issue, but I do want to make this statement and make it clear, which I think I did at the last hearing. Since I've been in Congress, we've been talking about getting better pay for the frontline workers, and we've made minimal progress in that regard. And that's why I broke from my opposition to Title V funding and said I was going to support it. So let that be a warning that if we don't get this issue fixed, I'm going to support it going forward. And the reason I was concerned about the funding last time is I think people in the headquarters get paid quite a bit of money, and they're doing just fine. I'm worried about the frontline workers. I'm worried about their ability to have an adequate pay given the very serious job that they have. So let this be the warning shot. I'm not backing down from making sure they get the support they need. It's well past time for us to institutionalize that that salary for them. Admiral Patoski, I want to stick with you strictly because you're in the job now. I agree with what Mr. Pistol said about the emerging technologies that the bad guys seem to be quite adept at creating. And obviously we have something the size of my cell phone that can take down a good sized airplane. So I think computed tomography is one of the key things that we need to have. And my concerns are that the computed tomography is going to take so long to implement given the budgetary constraints that we have right now that it's going to be rendered obsolete by the time we get them all online in 10 years. So Admiral Patoski, very briefly, do you have a number? Can you tell us what you need to get 100% CT technology at all the airport checkpoints nationwide and how long it will take?
Yes, sir. Thanks for your comments. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, CT is one of the most important technologies for us to advance in our checkpoint system. We've done a really good job so far. We've got 300 plus units already in place, thanks to your support and the support of this committee back in 2019. We also just awarded an option for 314 more of our brand new mid-size integrated systems. But when I look at the length of time it's going to take us to get to all 2,400 plus X-ray systems currently in the country, that's a very, very long time. And what I asked my team to look at is, hey, given the contract vehicles that we are going to have in place or currently have in place, how much could we spend every year reasonably to be able to accelerate the implementation of this very important technology? And the answer is about $350 million a year just for CT. But I say that
years? How many years, sir?
Probably about 5 years to get it all done. But this is bounded a bit by practicality. I mean, we just can't buy them all and replace them all at the same time. That needs to be sequenced because there's a lot of airport work that needs to be done. And there's also manufacturing capability. But it's really critical for us to get this technology in place as soon as we can. It makes, I can't even describe, given this venue that we're in, the difference in detectability that CT technology provides. It's really critical for our security.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think we should really try and prioritize that with the other committees. I think this is a message that is really important for our nation's security, the aviation security. Now, I want to switch gears and talk about my one-stop security pilot legislation, which will be voted on by the House this week, we hope. It's an important bipartisan legislation, Mr. Patoski, which will raise a global baseline of aviation security, and it will improve post-pandemic travel. So, Administrator Patoski, could you explain how one-step screening will streamline international travel while also enhancing global aviation security standards?
Yes, sir. And I'll start with how it will enhance global aviation security. And it will do that in a number of ways. One, it will improve the technology baseline globally with the airports that we have one-stop agreements with, because we will specify what standards to screening that we require and our partners are going to require for the other direction coming to them. We'll also promote the establishment of common standards for this technology around the globe, particularly in the nations that have the most advanced aviation systems. And we feel that will drive the technology industry to build to those standards. So in toto, it brings the entire global aviation system up to a much higher level. Additionally, part of the one-stop security initiative is to do covert testing that's integrated, teams that are integrated with that country's experts and our experts to do covert testing to really assess the effectiveness of the screening regimes that we put in place. So in toto, it increases the security of flights approaching, bound for the United States. That's a very good thing. And then from a passenger perspective, what that means for a passenger, and I'll use a hypothetical. Let's say for argument's sake, we have a one-stop agreement with London Heathrow Airport in the United Kingdom. What that will mean is a passenger flying from London Heathrow through JFK and the follow-on flight, let's say to Charlotte, North Carolina, does not need to be rescreened in JFK, because that screening will be satisfactorily accomplished to our desires at London Heathrow. So it greatly facilitates travel and also improves security. And whenever I look at technology investments or policy adjustments, I'm looking for that two type benefit. One, first and foremost, improve security, and then secondly, improve the passenger experience and facilitate travel.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before you yield back, I just want to say to Mr. Neffinger, Mr. Pistol, Mr. Patoski, Mr. Lloyd, that I think history is going to smile kindly upon all of you, because you've taken an impossible situation and you made it very good. So I'm proud of all of you for the work that you've done to keep our airline safe. And I'm very proud of the culture you've created, whereby you listen to oversight, you welcome oversight, and you act upon it. And you've made TSA a much better agency because of it. So please don't stop taking the input from us, because we're on the same team here. And I appreciate all the frontline workers have done, and we got to do more to help them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize other members for questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. Members are reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning, and to then mute themselves once they have finished speaking, and to leave their cameras on so they are visible to the chair. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for yielding. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you to the ranking member for us having a common viewpoint of national security. Let me take a moment to salute the Transportation Security Administration and the TSOs, of which every moment I have an opportunity to fly into different airports, small, medium, and large. I take a moment to talk to TSOs, supervisors, managers, and others about both their needs and as well our commitment to their service. Let me thank you to Administrator Patoski for committing to collective bargaining. Of course, we all support the chairman's legislation on that very important issue of dignity, professionalism, and of course, service. Administrator Patoski, let me go to you immediately. And as my time wanes, I will be quickly trying to go to others. Tell us in a pictorial oration of the daily protection in stopping various incidences that might, or individuals that might get on planes, knives, guns, and otherwise, that you can see over the landscape that your agency and TSOs are stopping.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I really appreciate that question. I'll just give you a sense for what we've detected this calendar year to date in our checkpoints. And if we start with live weapons, these are weapons that either have a round chambered or a magazine inserted into the weapon. We've detected 4,300 plus live weapons in our screening checkpoints. And the rate of weapons carriage in our checkpoints now is about 2 times per million passengers what it was in 2019. And generally, when I reference prior activity, I go back to 2019 because that was the pre-COVID year. Other weapons, which would be anything from stun guns to replica weapons, almost 3,400 other weapons. And then go on to prohibited items, which are things like knives and throwing stars, things of that nature, about 3,250 prohibited items. And then one of the things that's really important about our system is that we validate the identity of every single passenger as they approach the screening checkpoint. And this is designed to ensure that we do provide the right level of screening based on the risk that a passenger may represent. So having the right ID is critically important. And we've detected over 300 fraudulent IDs already. And with the advent of the credential authentication technology, those numbers will continue to go up. And I should also mention, and I really appreciate your support for our officers and for our federal air marshals. Federal air marshals perform a really critical function of in-flight security and security in and around the airport. And we place our federal air marshals on flights where we deem there is more risk than others. And this is also a job that is not easy to perform. They have to be alert 100% of the time and ready to quickly jump into action should the need be. And so I join you in recognizing the terrific work of our frontline workforce and really all those that support them, that enable them to do the great work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Admiral Neffinger, Pistol, and Lloyd, please try to get my question in for all of you to get a few seconds in, because I value and appreciate your leadership. The Taliban now is in control of Afghanistan. We know what happened 21 years ago or 20 years ago. Just an assessment of how difficult or how important TSOs are, although domestically based, even though we have an infrastructure overseas, in what may be proposed or new volatility. Admiral, can you do that real quickly? I have seconds, please. Admiral Neffen.
Yes, Congressman Jackson, thank you very much for the question. That's an important question. I think I go back to my opening comments, and this is where it takes great imagination to think about what the next level of threats and the next array of threats may be. And in doing so, recognizing that, one, we hope we never catch a terrorist at the checkpoint. There are a lot of failures that would lead to that event happening. But I will tell you, the last line of defense, in the airport is clearly the TSO on the front line. And so
Can I jump to Pistol? I'm so sorry, Admiral.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. Good to see you, ma'am. I think there is still a number of gaps in the intelligence collection opportunities as it relates to the direct threat posed by the Taliban at this point. And so the TSOs and TSA really being the last line of defense, it's even more incumbent and crucial that they are doing their job in the best professional way they can to make sure that nobody slips through the cracks.
Mr. Lloyd?
Yeah, I would just endorse exactly what's already been said. The criticality of the link between the intelligence world of TSA and the rest of the intelligence community is absolutely crucial to being able to imagine in advance what the scenario could be that we can then plan to deal with if in fact it actually happens. So I would I would just highlight the criticality of the positive linkage between TSA's intelligence wing and the rest of the intelligence community.
Very important. Thank you so very much. I'm sorry for the cutting off of the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of these gentlemen and TSA. Salute them, as I said before. Thank you again.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I'd like to commend the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing today on the state of TSA 20 years after 9/11. We certainly, as a body, salute our frontline agents there that struggled every day with millions of passengers, very professionally to keep America safe. On 9/11, 9 of the 19 hijackers had been flagged in some manner by federal aviation as potential terror threats, and yet they were still allowed to get on a plane due to the security protocols at the time. And since then, of course, the nation has responded with the creation of Department of Homeland Security and TSA. And over the last 20 years, we have adjusted as American citizens to this new enhanced level of screening and safety. And we appreciate the professionalism that we witness every day. We have evolved, TSA has changed, and American citizens have adapted to those changes. We expect that the intelligence failures prior to 9/11 will not be repeated. The Pentagon is actively warning Congress of the increased likelihood of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. It is critical that in this time of heightened threat levels, that all gaps in our national security are reviewed and sufficiently addressed. So it's with that spirit that I point out the TSA website currently has 16 forms of identification that are accepted to get on an airplane. These documents are not codified in law and are subject to change based on bureaucratic orders and rules. The TSA website states that in coordination with DHS counterparts, TSA has identified acceptable alternative identification for use in special circumstances at the checkpoint. Now, many would consider this a loophole that has allowed undocumented human beings to access our airplanes across the country through TSA. So, Administrator Patoski, would you address that, sir, in a brief response? Has Secretary Mayorkas instructed TSA to allow undocumented migrants on a plane without one of the 16 acceptable identification documents?
No, sir, we work very hard with undocumented new arrivals into the country that need follow-on air travel to ensure that we're sure who they are, and we work very closely.
Wait, excuse me, good sir. You're saying that you're sure who an undocumented immigrant is that's getting on an airplane, although the Department of Homeland Security itself and Customs and Border Patrol will readily admit we're not positive who they are. In most cases, we're accepting who they tell us they are, but you're telling me you know who they are. That's what you're saying right now.
What I'm saying is we use the very same data that Customs and Border Protection obtains.
Exactly, good sir.
Right,
So I'm just
right, yeah.
asking, America needs to know. America needs to know. I get it. You're accepting what Customs and Border Protection is sending you, but America needs to know are undocumented illegal immigrants that are being transported to another part of our country, or they get in on airplanes without a picture ID and without the American government, Customs and Border Protection, TSA, Department of Homeland Security, are they getting on airplanes to travel when we readily admit that we're not sure who they are and they do not have photo ID, that they do not have one of the TSA's own 16 forms of acceptable identification that Americans themselves are subject to? I mean, yes or no, these people getting on a plane with us?
People are getting on planes after they're thoroughly screened before
Thoroughly
they even
screened by who?
by the TSA, sir.
It's screened by TSA. You mean going through the checkpoints like we're
Yes,
all,
sir. So
but they're
so
going,
we're
but
sure
just
when they
clarify,
enter
please, good sir, in the interest of time, are they going through, like I have to have my photo ID to go through TSA checkpoints. Does an illegal immigrant that's being transported somewhere else in the country on an airplane, are they required to have a photo ID? Yes or no?
we have processes for people that do not have photo IDs.
Are they required to have a photo ID? My God, it's hard to get a straight answer out of this administration.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Can the gentleman answer my question, good sir? You have extended that courtesy, Mr. Chairman. Can the gentleman answer my question?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Can the gentleman
recognizes-
answer my question? Mr. Chairman, I object to my colleagues
Well,
across the
I'm gonna
aisle
tell you,
being granted
your
additional time, and yet Republicans are not.
No,
Can
no,
Mr. Patoski answer my question?
no.
It's
the
a yes or
gentleman's
no answer.
time has expired. Now, either you recognize it, I'm gonna cut your mic off.
Well, please
Chair-
do. But the man
Well,
should answer the question.
we-
It's
we
yes or
will-
no. You have allowed my colleagues to answer the question.
Look, you can be civil, Mr. Higgins.
I'm trying to
you
be
can
civil,
just-
Mr.
you-
Chairman. You're stopping
No,
the
I
the
am
man
more.
runs the TSA. It's a
I
yes
am-
or no
hey,
question.
but look-
Will he answer it or not?
I'm not gonna put the administrator in this position. Your time has expired. Chair
Wow.
recognizes the gentleman
Thank you, Mr.
from
Chairman.
New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, we hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Let's see, this is for Mr. Pesky and Neffinger and Pistol. You know, over the years, TSA has rolled out very sophisticated technologies and policies to provide formidable defense against potential terrorist attacks. Unfortunately, TSO pay and benefits have not evolved with the rest of the agency, as many longtime employees remain near the bottom of the pay band. Unlike the general schedule or the GS pay system used by most federal agencies, the TSA pay system has not historically provided for regular salary increases. Salary increases are not built into TSA's baseline budget, and identifying funding for fixing the problem of low pay has proven to be difficult for Congress and multiple administrations across party lines. Do you believe TSA employees should receive regular salary increases at the same level as most other federal employees? And that's a yes and no for everyone.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
Absolutely.
Great. We're all on the same page. But it seems like it's been a 20-year effort to get this enacted. Would having such salary increases required under the law make funding such increases through the annual budget and appropriations process easier?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes, sir, it would.
Okay. Well, I thank you all for the concise answers. I just don't understand why, with the legislation that the chairman has put forth, we cannot get to the end goal of making our TSOs the front line, the men and women in the field that have kept us safe for 20 years cannot be compensated in the manner in which they should be. It is just a failure on our part, all of us here in these positions, that has not happened. And I you know, it really pains me to see this constant, I don't know, situation where the people working the hardest, the people on the front lines, the people that are doing the grunt work at times are never compensated as well as the people sitting in the lofty offices. And it's just not right. It harkens back, you know, to a history in this country where the people working the hardest are treated the worst. And we just have to stop it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yield back. Chair recognizes gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes. Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Patoski, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for the hard work that your men and women do every day in keeping the traveling public safe. We know that the TSA officers are dedicated and they are hardworking public servants that do a difficult job, and we know the importance of that job in protecting our homeland. I want to follow up very briefly on Congressman Higgins' questioning as it relates to the importance of photo ID in the screening process. And we know that that is something that has been required now since 9/11 for members of the traveling public to show some sort of photo ID. We know that that is something that your men and women use during that screening process. I know firsthand from when I was down on the border at McAllen, seeing immigrants who were in the airport waiting to board flights that did not have that photo ID. And so my question to you is, how can we adequately screen migrants without a photo identification? If we are going to require that of every American who is getting on a plane, how can we adequately screen those who do not have that photo ID available to them?
Yes, sir. With migrants that may not have a photo ID in their possession, we rely on the biographic and biometric information that CBP has collected when they cross the border. When we have the technology to have that information right in front of us as the person is presenting themselves for screening. Additionally, our protocols always require different levels of screening based on the level of identity verification that we have. And so if you show up to a security checkpoint and you do not have a photo ID, we have processes in place where we do whatever we can to see if we can establish your identity. And in this case, the same process happens with migrants with our CBP colleagues. And then we provide enhanced screening to make sure that a person doesn't have anything that would concern us in their carry-on bags, on their person, or in any check baggage. Migrants typically do not have any check baggage, though.
Let me ask you, has TSA ever prohibited any migrants from boarding flights and flying to the interior? Has there been instances where TSA has told Customs Border Patrol that you will not allow those migrants to travel?
I'm sure I don't have the exact numbers, sir, but I'm sure there have been instances where we have not been satisfied within the department. And we've gone back and done some additional work. And so the person didn't travel at the time they wanted to, or they might not have traveled at all. But I don't have the specific numbers in front of me.
And let me ask you about a particular program, the CBP One app that is used. I know that is something that TSA is working with CBP on. And at this time, I would ask the clerk if she would please put up a photo to accompany my questions. And Mr. Chairman, I would like this photograph to be entered into the record as well. As that is being put up, I will let you know that this was a photograph. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a photograph that was taken at DCA, and it says there that photo capture, the particular section of the document that I want to question you to, that the photo capture is optional. And as it relates to migrants, that migrants may decline to have their photograph taken as part of this screening process. And so it would seem to me that we have a two-tiered system, that we have a system for United States citizens where we are required by law, and TSA requires us to show photo ID before traveling. And then we have a second system for non-citizens in which not only are they not required to show a photo ID, but they can even decline to have their photograph taken if they decide to do so. And so I would ask if you could, if at all possible, please talk about the disparity in when U.S. citizens travel versus when migrants travel, and why migrants have the ability to decline or have the photograph taken, but yet as a citizen, I don't have the ability to decline to present a photo ID.
Yes, sir. I'm unaware of any circumstance where an undocumented individual has declined to have their photo taken.
But they do have that option, do they not? From the document there, clearly the document states not once but twice that they have the option, and not trying to be argumentative, but you would agree with me that that document says on two different occasions that they have the option to decline to have their photograph taken.
Again, I'm not aware of any circumstance where that has occurred.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Just wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member, Mr. Katko, for holding this hearing. I was also in New York to commemorate solemn remembrance of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And Mr. Patoski, you're absolutely right. United in memory, together in mission. I remember 20 years ago watching civilians run from those burning buildings while the first responders were essentially running in, knowing that we're probably facing certain death. That moment did unite us in America. But today, the lessons are we also have to be ready. And that's what this hearing is all about. we talk about today about our TSA frontline workers. I also chaired the subcommittee on transportation and maritime, so this issue is very near and dear to my heart. But you know, I look at the issue of equity and pay not as an issue of pay, but rather professionalism. Nobody would question what we pay our police officers or FBI agents because they do the job and they put their lives out there. And one of you witnesses mentioned that the last line of defense for airlines is essentially those TSA officers, those people who are looking into the screens, who are looking at us, who are really being pains to the passengers for making those passengers open their luggage, look in their places to make sure there's nothing there that shouldn't be going into a plane. So we have to make sure they're professional. It's not only about pay, it's about to make sure that these folks are there for 30 years. We need their professional expertise to protect us in the air. So, you know, Mr. Patoski, I would ask you to continue to think about it as professionalizing the workforce and make sure that Americans have the best line of defense. Their last line of defense is their best. I have a question for you, similar to Mr. Higgins when it comes to IDs. Remembering 911, those folks that got on those airlines had valid IDs. The problem we had was a break in our intelligence system. We knew those folks maybe should have been questioned twice before they got on a flight, but they weren't. We were acting, Homeland Security, in silos. And number two, the issue of IDs, I think, is secondary to making sure that those people don't have an explosive on them and making sure that they can actually should be boarding a plane. We can have an ID anywhere in the world, valid visa, valid passport, and get on a flight. We just have to make sure that we coordinate intel with the rest of the world, with our friends and frenemies, so to speak, to make sure somebody doesn't bring down a flight. So my question in the last few moments that I have, sir, is how are we working to make sure, number one, TSA is no longer in silos, but sharing that information. And number two, you're working with the folks across the pond, South America, to make sure we have the best intel available. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Congressman Correa, thank you very much for your comments. I couldn't agree more. And what I would say is that in addition to the comments you made, you know, TSO officers, transportation security officers, they are the last line of defense. They have enormous responsibility on their shoulders. It's our job to give them the discretion, the procedures, and the technology so that they're successful in their very important mission. The other thing I would emphasize is, you know, our system is built on layers of security. We don't rely on any single layer to ensure that somebody who gets on a plane shouldn't be on a plane. We have multiple layers, as Mr. Neffinger mentioned at the very beginning. In many ways, if a terrorist presents themselves for screening, we've already had some issues in the other layers that should have picked that up before that person even arrived. And then going back to the migrants for a second, the non-documented individuals with follow-on travel in this country, we have captured their biometrics when they cross the border. The one app does that. Those biometrics are compared to our screening databases in our secure flight system. So there is, given the biometric, there is some surety that that person is not listed on any of our watch lists and has travel. And then, as you mentioned, we do the right screening level based on the information we have and the risk that the individual presents. The last thing I'll mention, sir, very quickly is one of those layers, and you talk about 9/11, one of those layers now is a very robust federal Air Marshal service that are assigned to flights based on the risk of the flight. And they are an incredibly professional group of individuals, and their mission is to prevent a terrorist attack in flight.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have, or is my time out?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Patoski, did you say that when Congressman Guest put up on the TSA website that a photo capture is voluntary. Are you denying that? Are you saying that doesn't exist?
No, sir, I'm not denying it. I'm saying I'm unaware of any situation where that has occurred. And additionally, their biometric has already been checked with the checks that we would make in our secure flight system as they cross the border.
Okay, let me ask you this. How do you check biometrics when they cross illegally, when they don't go through the screening process? Walk me through how you get the biometrics if they cross the border illegally.
Right. Well, so if we have somebody present at the screening checkpoint that does
No,
not have,
I'm saying if they cross illegally where they don't go through the screening process, walk me through what you do to get the biometrics when there's no screening to them. They're illegal.
correct, and so those individuals would generally not be allowed access to the screening checkpoint. These are the folks that are
No. If they
undocumented.
cross, you're missing, you're not answering my question. It's a simple question. If you come across, you don't have the biometrics. If they go to the airport, you have no documentation. What do? Do you turn them away? Or if they've got the right not to have their picture? And these are people who you have no information on. How do you walk me through the screening process? Americans need to know this. And
Yes,
just
sir.
walk me through what you do.
And I'll walk you through quickly. Whenever somebody presents themselves at a screening checkpoint without identification, we have a process we go through to try to verify that identification. Depending on what that process shows us, depends on the level of screening we provide that person, or if we're not satisfied that the person should continue into the sterile area of an airport, then they are not allowed into the sterile area.
Okay, let me ask you this. I was at McAllen, Texas. I've been to the border several times. Out of 120 seats, 100 of them were by those who had cardboard things across their neck saying, we don't speak English. Show me which airport to get on, which airplane to get on. They were allowed to get on. How do you explain that?
We coordinate all of those very closely, sir, with Customs and Border Protection. And so my assumption, based on the information you provided, is that all of those individuals did cross the border, were registered, their biometrics recorded by CBP.
Well, I don't know that. You assume that, but
Our procedures would require that.
You have to be right 100% of the time. The terrorists that made 9/11 happen and killed 3,000 people, they, as has been said, they had the identification. They were just terrorists. We've got suicide bombers who have got sophisticated things they can put in their bodies to blow the whole airplane up, including themselves. How do you screen against that?
We do a very thorough screening of anything an individual's carrying, and they're on person, including a pat down. So we are sure.
How about if they swallow? How about if they swallow it or put up their one of their cavities? How does that screen?
We have a very thorough screening process for both on-person detection and for carry-on bags, that we are very certain that an individual who comes into the sterile area of an airport will not be carrying anything that could harm anybody on a flight. Not
be carrying it, but they could put it in one of their body cavities.
We have not seen that occur, sir.
Okay. All right. So I guess what I'm saying is we got an open border with known terrorists are getting across, the ones we catch, but it's the ones we have not caught. And here we are. I haven't heard a peep out of TSA objected to this, because we're going to have 1.5 to 2 million illegals that are coming into the country. Some go through the screening. Those that get away, the terrorists, are smart enough not to do it. And you're saying you got 100% proof that you will either deny them access on the airplane to protect Americans and those who have to go through the process, as Congressman Guest says, or you've got some magic way of finding out who they are when you have no record. You have no knowledge of, you don't have biometrics, but you're telling me now that you've got a foolproof way to make sure that doesn't happen, that they don't get on the airplane, and that they, you all of a sudden you're finding out a history that they have not given before because they haven't come through the screening process.
Yes, sir. And what I'm telling you is that people that board aircraft anywhere in this country, including the southwest border, are thoroughly screened, and we would not permit them on aircraft if we had any concern that they might present a threat to that aircraft or the passengers on board.
Well, if you don't have any information on them, how does that not present a concern?
We have layers of security, sir, and identity verification is one layer of security.
Here, I recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for convening this hearing. Administrator Patoski, I want to begin by thanking you for your many years of service to our nation. And I want to begin also by thanking you for your work on cybersecurity at TSA, specifically for your release of 2 pipeline security directives in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline incident. I am, however, concerned that the second of these directives was not made public. I understand, of course, the reluctance to publish security directives may be rooted in existing TSA practice, like aviation security. I know you and I had that conversation on the phone yesterday. Certainly understand that part of it, but knowing the specifics of airport screening protocols would be highly useful, to terrorist groups who otherwise would need to physically surveil airports to identify vulnerabilities that could enable terrorist attacks. However, in the cyber realm, bad actors don't need physical access to conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance against our critical infrastructure. They can do so from anywhere in the world. So what's more, other agencies also publish security directives, including CISA, which is specific vulnerabilities and timelines called out in emergency directives TSA is required to follow. So in my view, all TSA is doing by shrouding its cybersecurity directives in secrecy is denying itself the benefit and the ability to improve these directives through the feedback of the larger cybersecurity community. So my question, Administrator Patoski, is would you consider changing your policy and publishing the pipeline directives and any future cybersecurity directives from TSA?
Yes, Congressman Langevin, thank you very much, and thank you for your time yesterday. I enjoyed very much and learned a great deal in talking with you as always. And as I said yesterday, yes, we will. We will take that back and look at that. You raised some very good points. I mean, our goal here is to provide as much information on what the right cybersecurity preventive measures are, and to get more and more organizations in my position, owners and operators of transportation systems in the country, to have stronger cybersecurity measures in place. And so I take your suggestion very seriously, sir. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. And Administrator Patoski, I want to also ask you about now about ensuring compliance with TSA security directives. I understand that that pipeline owners and operators must maintain documentation of their compliance with TSA regulations. I also understand that TSA has the ability to verify self-reported security controls through inspections. During these inspections, are TSA inspectors conducting on-network testing of systems?
Sir, right now they are not doing on-network testing of systems, penetration testing. That is something that CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and TSA are working on,
Okay.
and we think that's important as well.
So, look, having inspectors and auditors conducting on-network testing, I believe, is crucial for evaluating a covered entity's cybersecurity posture. Evaluating the architecture of a network is not enough. Just because a covered entity designs its human resources network, for example, to be segmented from its operational technology network, does not automatically make that true. On-network testing, I believe, is critical to verify those kinds of attestations. So in the absence of this testing, TSA relies on self-reporting, which I do not believe is sufficient. In my view, the solution is for TSA to implement third-party auditing of its covered entities. An impartial third-party auditor, such as a certified private sector company or even CISA, would have both the impartiality and on-network testing personnel necessary to ensure covered entities actually adhere to TSA's regulations. So, Administrator Patoski, TSA has the authority over pipeline security for nearly 20 years, yet the first directive was issued in May. I realize this is early days, but with that in mind, will you commit to working with me and the rest of this committee on implementing third-party auditing to verify compliance with TSA security directives?
Yes, sir. I commit to working with you, and I appreciate your expertise.
Thank you, Administrator. And should you require additional statutory or budgetary support to implement third-party auditing, will you work with this committee to obtain that support?
Yes, sir.
Very good. That's all I can ask. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the young lady from Iowa for 5 minutes, Ms. Miller Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member as well, and thank you to all of those providing testimony to us today. Since its inception in 2012, TSA PreCheck and its expedited screening has become very popular among members of the traveling public, myself included. Administrator Patoski, as travel volume continues to recover, what more can TSA do to significantly increase PreCheck enrollment moving forward?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. And actually, PreCheck enrollment now is almost 11 million passengers, and our enrollment rates are now back at 2019 rates. And so there are now more people basically resuming the practice of enrolling in PreCheck as pre-pandemic. Additionally, we are increasing our enrollment services operation by adding 2 additional vendors to PreCheck enrollment. So that should make PreCheck much more accessible to people and much easier for them to register for that important program. I appreciate your interest in it.
And also, one of the things I've noticed when I'm flying in and out of various airports, sometimes it's smaller airports, but sometimes it's the very large ones early in the morning or late in the evening, that the PreCheck lanes aren't operational. So what specifically is TSA doing to, you're promoting enrollment in PreCheck, but you also don't have the lanes open, even though oftentimes there seems like there's more than adequate personnel to have the TSA PreCheck lane open. So is there a number of passengers that have to go through for the PreCheck lane to be open? How is that determined? And why can't I always count on a PreCheck lane being open?
And what we look at in terms of processing is how long the wait is for passengers. And we measure that at every single lane in the country every hour. Our standard for PreCheck processing is 5 minutes or less. And so our protocol would be to open additional lanes if we couldn't achieve that 5-minute wait time standard. The other thing that we've instituted in airports that have a very small number of lanes, and sometimes it's hard to dedicate a single lane to PreCheck, is a process called blended screening, which means that the passenger in front of you might be a non-PreCheck passenger. They will get the level of screening that requires. The next person, yourself, for example, as a PreCheck passenger, would then get PreCheck screening. And so we're using that to provide passengers with the convenience of PreCheck and the speed of PreCheck. But whenever we see the wait time ticking up beyond 5 minutes overall, then that's the time to open up an additional lane.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that those individuals who have PreCheck clearance or have clear typically are very efficient in how they package their materials, and people that aren't, that blended screening takes a lot of time because the person in front of you may not, they have to take their liquids out, they have to take their laptop out, they have to take their belts, their keys, their coins, etc. So you understand the dilemma it poses, but it's good to know that it's a 5-minute waiting period. So I'll keep track of that in the future and then let you know. And then lastly, Apple recently announced that it is partnering with the TSA to have its customers use mobile driver's licenses on their phones or watches as proof of identification at certain airport checkpoints. Now, to me, this collaboration seems very exciting. I always worry about losing my driver's license when I put it away to quickly go through the screening process. So, when should we expect to see this technology at airport checkpoints, and at which states? And please explain the TSA's approach to incorporating this security and efficiency benefits that digital identity provides at the checkpoint.
Yes, ma'am. The digital identity or the mobile driver's license is a very exciting initiative, and we've worked with a cooperative research and development agreement with Apple, had the same opportunity available to non-Apple manufacturers as well. We expect to roll this out at certain airports, and of course that requires the states to also agree that their driver's license can be uploaded in a digital format. There are several states that have already agreed to that. And we anticipate that we'll roll out the mobile driver's license capability in select airports beginning at the very end of this calendar year or into early calendar year 2022. So it's right around the corner.
Well, thank you so much for that. And as you said, it is really exciting that it will be coming in the forefront. So I hope it gets to my airports, and I'll check with my state. So thank you for that. Thank you, Chair Thompson. I yield back my time.
Lady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York for 5 minutes, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member. I thank our panelists for their expert witness this morning. And my first question is to the entire panel. In the 20 years since TSA's formation, the agency has confronted a wide range of threats which continue to evolve. In your view, what has emerged as the most prevalent challenges to TSA's mission, to its workforce, and to its resources? Administrator Patoski, why don't we just start with you?
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Appreciate that. And with respect to the threat picture, I mean, the thing that's emerged over the past several years is the prevalence of a domestic terror threat, which is very different from a foreign-based or foreign-inspired terrorist. And it's required us to refocus our effort. We have a very mature risk identification and risk management process in TSA. It impacts both the aviation sector and all of the surface modes of transportation. So there's a change in the threat, and additionally, the threat is not just physical any longer. There's a physical threat and a cyber threat that's developed, and we saw that with our directives to the pipeline industry following the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So we adjust based on the changes to the threat and the linkages that we have to the intelligence community to make sure that we're staying ahead of where the threat is going. We change our procedures, we change our technology in that regard. And I hope that's responsive to your question.
And what would you say that threat has presented to the workforce? Is there a need for additional training and resources specific to that training?
Well, the threat has presented itself to the workforce in a number of ways. The key remedy we have for that is to ensure that the workforce has the right tools to do the very, very important job that they have. And so some of the technologies that we've talked about this morning, the credential technology, the new X-ray systems, the on-person detection systems are very important to putting the right tools in the hands of our workforce. Additionally, what's important as well is to have a significant and visible presence to deter any potential threat actors from acting out. And this is particularly relevant in the case of domestic terrorists.
Would either of the other panelists care to respond?
Yes, yeah, Congresswoman, this is John Pistol. Unfortunately, in addition to the deaths of TSOs from COVID, it was during my tenure that the murder, the execution of TSO Gerardo Hernandez at LAX occurred by, however, this disgruntled, mentally health challenged individual who shot him in the back and then shot 2 other TSOs. So that's always an issue of on the minds of TSOs and of concern that what happens when somebody who with that mindset and with a weapon can simply walk into an airport before going through any security and open fire. So that's something that I think it's a challenge, because in working closely with the airport police, the sworn law enforcement, in addition to some other resources, that is one of the things that continues to be of issue, I believe.
And Congresswoman Clark, let me just add to what Mr. Pistol said. I was in Brussels Airport on the morning of March 22nd, 2016, when the Brussels Airport attacks, 2 suicide bombers detonated their large suitcase bombs in the public area. So I think the public areas of the airport are far more challenging now than they used to be, and are clearly a potential target area. So we've done a great job of keeping people from getting into sterile areas of airport, but those public areas are of great concern. And as people can rapidly radicalize because of the ability to find like-minded ideological individuals on the internet and through social media, it becomes much more challenging to stay ahead of that.
And in keeping that, I guess, Administrator Patoski, TSA has had to work closely with other agencies across federal government throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Has TSA's collaboration with other federal agencies matured since its founding? And are there areas in which TSA still needs to improve its interagency coordination efforts?
I mean, I think our interagency coordination efforts are quite outstanding. We have very, very strong relationships across the board with all of our interagency partners. I think the continued area of focus for us, and it's not that the relationships need improvement, it's just that the focus is going to be even more so on the surface transportation systems and the modes of surface transportation safety that exists in the Department of Transportation. But the relationships, I think, are very, very strong and very important to us.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today. I appreciate this timely and important look back on the 20th anniversary thereabouts of the founding of the Transportation Security Administration and of our differing approach to travel security and airport security, but not limited to that. And that touches upon my first question for the administrator. While most of the TSA resources have been focused on commercial aviation, your agency also has responsibility for the security of mass transit, for freight rail, elements of highway infrastructure, and other critical transportation sectors. The ransomware attack in the Colonial Pipeline earlier this year was the first opportunity for many of us to learn that TSA also had responsibility for pipeline security. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Administrator, is how is the TSA ensuring that these missions are receiving adequate attention and resources? Are there any components of the broad mission apart from airport security that have been historically underfunded or neglected, either by Congress or DHS leadership?
Sir, the way we assess resource allocation within the agency, and this affects our allocation within the current budget year, then also our budget requests for the future years, is looking at the risks and how the risk is changing. So this is informed by intelligence information. It's informed by information we receive from our government partners and our private sector partners across the board. We assess risks. As the risk changes, then we put in risk mitigation measures that might require a redirection of funds. We've also organizationally, to make sure, to your point, that surface transportation security is achieving the right priority. Thanks to the work of this committee in our 2018 reauthorization, we've established a separate assistant administrator position and staff for surface transportation security, and have a similar staff in our policy operations. So surface transportation policy has its own organization. Surface transportation operations is also a clearly identified organization. Finally, we've established regional networks where we have a leader, member of the senior executive service in 5 regions around the country, all aligned with the FEMA regions, that oversees surface transportation security in the interaction with those owners and operators on a regional basis, and has available to them literally hundreds of inspectors to be able to do the important work we do.
I appreciate that answer, Mr. Administrator, and I just wanted to quickly follow up. It's been 2 decades since these missions were put under TSA during that, or close to 2 decades during that reorganization in the early 2000s. At this point, looking back on 15 to 20 years of operations, do you think that any of these missions should be reassigned to other components within DHS or within the broader executive branch?
No, sir, I do not. I think the missions that are assigned to TSA are exactly the right missions. And I think we have demonstrated that over the course of 20 years. And I would just highlight with respect to the Colonial Pipeline, because of the authorities Congress has provided us in law and reinforced in our reauthorization, we were able to move very, very quickly in putting measures in place to mitigate any future attacks on critical pipeline systems. So I think the mission set we have is exactly right for TSA. And it's incumbent upon us, of course, to make sure that we coordinate robustly, to the prior question, with our interagency partners, not just at the federal level, but also particularly in surface transportation systems at the state and local and municipal levels.
And on that interagency partner point, can you give a better or a little bit additional description on TSA? How would they collaborate with specifically the intelligence community, but also with the private sector on security, vetting procedures, intelligence sharing? What type of coordination problems persist, and what is TSA doing to address those challenges?
Yes, sir. It's probably best that I just briefly describe how when we see a threat stream developing, how we change our procedures, how we might change some of the requirements we place on private sector or other public owners and operators of systems. And essentially the way we do that is to bring the chief security officers of those organizations in, provide them an intelligence brief so that they're looking at the intelligence that we see, and then collaborate closely with them to achieve the security outcomes that we know we have to achieve. This can happen fast. We've been very successful at doing this. It can happen fast, and what it net results in is a private sector or a local government partner who understands the threat and understands the rationale for the measures we put in place. And then for the private sector operators, they can also offer different ways of accomplishing the security outcome we want to accomplish. Sometimes their measures are actually more effective because they know their systems better than we do at times. And oftentimes they require less cost. And from my perspective, as long as we can achieve the desired security outcome, we will generally approve those, what we call alternative measures.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask the administrator about the new opening of the international travel markets. I represent Las Vegas McCarran Airport, and we welcome a lot of international travelers, and we expect that number to increase. It was especially good to hear that the administration had lifted the restrictions on a number of places around the world. At the same time that these new travelers are going to be coming, American travelers are going out again. They have this pent-up need to go out and travel after a year and a half of being locked down. So we're going to see a lot more people in the air. Now, we've seen that the aviation infrastructure really wasn't prepared to deal with so many at one time. It was kind of like the problem after 9/11. And I wonder how TSA is preparing to welcome all these new travelers, especially the international ones, and what resources you might need, something we might be able to do to help us accommodate them. We know that travel begins the minute you leave the house, and so your airport experience is a part of how you remember the trip, both going and coming. And so could you address that for us?
Yes, Congresswoman Titus, happy to address that. And one of the things that's very important for us is that we, in working with the carriers, project what we think air travel will be for the coming year. And I know that's hard to do sometimes the further out you go. But we've been very successful in identifying a window of the minimum and the maximum number of passengers, except for the COVID years. But certainly we were in fact very, very close to our estimates for this past summer. And so what that does is it drives the requirement for the staffing levels at airports around the country. And what's important here is that because of the training that is necessary to certify one of our officers and the important jobs they have at the checkpoints, we really need to hire people a good 4 to 5 months ahead of when the passenger need will be. And so we're in the process now really of looking at next summer's travel projections and ensuring that we bring on an adequate number of transportation security officers to handle that demand. Finally, we work very closely with the airports like your airport in Las Vegas to do whatever we can to make sure that we have the right number of lanes. And whenever an airport wants to add an additional lane to their screening checkpoint, we welcome that every single time, and we will staff those lanes so that we can manage the flows during the peak periods. Because as you know, there are certain times of the day when a lot of flights depart, and so those tend to be very challenging for everybody to get through, not just screening, but to get through ticketing and to get out to the gate.
Like a Monday morning after a Raiders game, you got a lot of people going through that airport. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And another question related to our international travelers is their ability to read the signs. I know if I'm in China in an airport and I can't read the signs, I'm going to be lost. And so we have a lot of those international travelers, as well as the fact that Las Vegas is an international city in terms of its residents. Our committee, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for helping with this, passed the Translate Act, and it got out of the House, got stuck in the Senate, but that was to be sure that all the signage is in several different languages, as well as is accessible for people who are visually or hearing impaired. Is TSA making any progress along those lines, even though the bill didn't pass?
Yes, ma'am. In fact, at Las Vegas Airport, the Las Vegas Airport Authority has been kind enough to provide an entire checkpoint to TSA to test out our newest technologies. And the benefit of this arrangement at Las Vegas is that we can actually divert passengers to this checkpoint and have actual passengers go through some of our changed processes or new technology so we can assess how it actually works in a real life situation. One of the things we look at in terms of signage are what are called totems that are electronic signs that can be changed to provide information in different languages. And you know, oftentimes we can make a pretty good guess at what languages would need to be accommodated in a given airport, given where the flights are flying off to or coming from. So a lot of work is being done on that and to provide as much easy information as we possibly can to passengers.
Well, that's great. I know that McCarran is an innovation checkpoint. You've been using some UV screening as well to clean the luggage places. And is that working out? Are you been able to translate some of the things that you've discovered there to other airports?
Yes, and we're still testing that UV technology out, ma'am. But essentially, when the bins get returned in what are called automatic screening lanes, these are 70 or 80 foot long lanes that allow multiple people to divest, to put their stuff in a bin at the same time. So that improves flow. It also makes sure that when we want to search a bag, that it's not accessible to that passenger. So a passenger can't reach and pull a bag that we know we need to search. And then there's plenty of room for a passenger to kind of recompose after the screening process is done. But the idea is that those bins would, as they travel back to the front of the lane, would be UV scanned, and that would reduce the virus load in those bins. And so far, our testing shows that works pretty well. We're just testing different times to dwell, and also the brightness of the light. But if this continues to proceed, I would expect that we would have that as an option in our systems across the nation.
Great. I know you've got that CAT system too, where you can scan your own ID. So that's great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good news. I'll yield back.
Yeah, I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Thompson. I appreciate this opportunity in this hearing. This question would be for Administrator Patoski. Earlier this year, I joined some of my colleagues on a trip in April to witness the crisis in the country that we are experiencing at our southern border. On our way back, there were multiple illegal migrants who had been apprehended between 24 and 72 hours prior to our flight. We also know that, we were told that there were several individuals on the known terrorist database that have been apprehended at the border. With such a quick turnaround time in processing migrants who illegally cross, that is 24 to 72 hours, how is TSA ensuring that the safety and security of domestic transportation systems are not compromised? I mean, these illegal migrants, many have not received a thorough medical assessment. And what concerns me greatly is how do we know whether these people have a criminal record in their home country? So what information are you relying on to properly vet migrant passengers? I mean, you're doing it within 24 to 72 hours. So how are you doing that?
Yes, sir. The vetting that we provide is done electronically, so the time is not the critical factor here. And essentially what we do is we take the biographic and biometric information and compare that to watch lists that we hold in the U.S. government to ensure that nobody who is a known or suspected terrorist is admitted into the airport without either very thorough screening, or they might be in a category where they're just not permitted to fly. There are different levels that we assess, and so it's based on biographic biometric information. We may not have information on their criminal history in their home country, but we do have that good biometric information to compare to our watch listing.
Okay, so I mean, I heard you in previous testimony talk about enhanced screening and multiple layers, and I think you said you do whatever we can. But if a person doesn't actually have ID, all right, and their name is Joe, and they tell you that their name is Sam. All right. Now, am I correct in that prior to getting on these flights, that if they don't have ID, you actually create a government ID for them? Is that right? Or is that not right?
No, sir, that's not right. And, you know, we make an assessment passenger to passenger as to whether we think a passenger should be permitted into the sterile air of an airport or onto an aircraft. So it's a very individualistic look. And I'm very confident that we do that carefully and successfully for every passenger that boards an aircraft.
Okay, so every American that flies has to have a photo ID, all right, that actually verifies who they are. But yet what you're telling me then is an illegal migrant doesn't have to have a photo ID, and we don't necessarily know who they are. You might actually screen them to make sure they don't have, you know, knives or whatever, something illegal on the airplane. But we don't know if they're a criminal coming into this country that has ill intent, something beyond the airport itself or not. Is that what you're telling me? Well, that you don't know that.
So this goes back to our multiple layers of security. And what I'll tell you we do know is we do know that any person who is permitted into the sterile area of an airport or boards an aircraft has been properly screened so that they do not pose a risk to the aircraft or to other people in the sterile area. I can guarantee you of that.
Okay, all right. So it's okay for TSA to allow people on an aircraft without an actual government issued ID. On what authority do you allow that? I mean, all of us, we have to have one.
Yes, sir. And I have the authority as the administrator to allow that. And there are passengers that are American citizens that occasionally show up in screening checkpoints that do not have their ID with them. And again, we have a verification process that we use to see if we can verify the identity. We make a judgment at the time based on criteria we have in the agency, and we ensure that all passengers are thoroughly screened before they board an aircraft.
Okay, all right. Let me follow up with you on this. TSA requires anyone traveling from other countries to provide a confirmed negative COVID-19 test within 72 hours prior to their entering the United States. Is this same standard being applied to illegal migrants as well?
To the best of my knowledge, it is not being applied to illegal migrants. That's a Centers for Disease Control decision.
Okay, but yet you enforce it, right?
Customs and Border Protection and TSA enforce it. Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Yeah, I recognize the young lady from.
Thank you. I yield back.
Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses for this very informative discussion that we're having. Let me associate myself with your comments and the ranking member and every member who has spoken out on behalf of the compensation and the recognition of the significance of our frontline workers here, our TSOs, and that they should have predictability, a pathway for a career, and this would help us with the morale issues. I have, I think about the unique question. In the 21st century, you may not need a terrorist aboard a plane to hijack it. As planes, trains, subways, and buses become increasingly automated, we need to be prepared for when hijackers inevitably put lives at risk by launching a cyber attack against the operational or navigation systems of the transportation target. As we've seen in recent ransomware attacks, our adversaries consider no targets off limits. So, Administrator Patoski, I'd like to speak to you about this. How does TSA work with its interagency partners to prevent malware from infecting the operational systems of its planes, trains, subways, buses, etc.? Are you in conversations with CISA and DOT and the FAA and other regulators to ensure this threat is addressed and that TSA plays a significant role in mitigating it? Mr. Patoski, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Congresswoman Watson-Coleman, for your question. And yes, we are in very close coordination with CISA for sure. And then with all of the modes in the Department of Transportation, whether it's FAA, PHMSA, Federal Railroads, et cetera. So that coordination is very good. Additionally, it's important that we coordinate closely with the owners and operators of those systems, and also to bring on cybersecurity expertise within TSA and to ensure we have good, strong connections with CISA to be able to benefit from their expertise overall. And so I think we've made a lot of progress on cybersecurity already, but I recognize, and I think you would agree, that a lot more needs to be done. And another key element, just to quickly mention, ma'am, is we are offering very specific briefings to the CEOs and CISOs of these organizations so that they understand the threat that we see and the urgency of getting at it.
Thank you, Mr. Patoski. I also know that there were advisories issued by you all after the malware attack on the pipeline. And I am wondering if you are considering the same kinds of oversight and accountabilities from these other transportation systems, the airplanes, the buses, the subways, the trains. I think that these are reasonable targets. And I don't know if you are engaged in those discussions. I don't know if you have enough resources to be able to address this area. And I'd like to have your response to that so that we could be as helpful as possible.
Yes, ma'am. We are engaged with those owners and operators and private sector companies. There's been a very good dialogue to date. We will, of course, base our actions based on the risk that we see. So the risk to one element of surface might not be the same as the risk to another, or even within the pipeline sector, there were certain pipeline owners and operators that we felt were at greater risk than others. And this dialogue has been very robust. It will continue. It supports the 60-day cybersecurity sprint that the Secretary has put in place for the transportation sector, which began on the 1st of September, runs through the end of October. So it's been an awful lot of effort on that, and I think we've made some very good progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And as listening to the testimony, I had a line of questioning, but I'm going to change my line of questioning. And so, Administrator Patoski, in order for somebody to get from Europe to the United States, what do they need to show in terms of COVID? Do they need to show they're vaccinated? Do they need to show that they've had a negative test? Somebody coming from Europe here, what do they need to show?
Yes, sir. New procedures will come in place very shortly where they will need to show that they're vaccinated and have had a test within a certain number of hours prior to flight.
And somebody coming from Canada, what do they need to show?
Same, sir. By air.
The same thing. Somebody crossing the border from the south, what do they need to show?
They don't need to show the same things coming from the southwest border. And this is also based on advice we've received from the Centers for Disease Control.
So the Centers for Disease Control seem to think that somehow the virus somehow is more contagious coming from Europe and from Canada than it is coming from the southern border, which kind of blows up the whole argument about following the science, doesn't it?
So I'm not a medical expert.
No, I'm not saying, no, sir, that's not for you. That's my comment. This whole thing about following the science is a bunch of hooey. If we tell Canadians that they have to be vaccinated and show a proof of negative tests, we do the same thing with Europeans, and we do nothing for people crossing the southern border. So this whole thing about the CDC following the science, it really doesn't. It follows political science, but not really the science. And so, it's been very, very illuminating today's testimony. One thing I would like to ask, one thing that I do support is the fine work that our TSA agents are doing with all these different kinds of guidances they're getting from the CDC and everybody else, the fine work that they do on the ground. And I would hope, sir, that you find a way to increase their pay and benefits of those that are doing the great work that the TSA does. And I know that I proposed that during our markup to actually increase the pay, and unfortunately the majority voted it down. So what steps are you taking to increase the pay and the benefits of those people that are on the ground doing this great work?
Yes, sir. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's an absolute imperative that we increase the pay for anyone in TSA, especially the frontline workforce, where there's a pay discrepancy between what they get paid and what their counterparts in the rest of government would get paid. They have very, very difficult jobs to do, significant responsibility on their shoulders, and very arduous work hours as well. And they're showing up at 3 o'clock in the morning in many airports to begin to open the screening process. My top priority is to continue to improve pay, but I want to improve it, and I know the chairman agrees with this 100%, as substantially as we can to get that equity in the system and to properly compensate people going forward. I would note that we have made attempts and we have made some progress in increasing pay, but it's not been enough. It's really important for us. We spend a lot of money with people that come into TSA and they identify for us the number one reason they leave is because of the pay. And it's very expensive to recruit and retain people without adequate pay structures. So I'm 100% in support of that, and we'll work very, very hard to make sure we get across the finish line.
Thank you very much, Administrator, and I yield my time.
Chair recognizes Young Lady from Florida for 5 minutes, Ms. Dimmons.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today to discuss, of course, this extremely important issue. I want to first of all associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues who paused for just a moment to take the time to thank our TSOs for the extraordinary job that they do every day. We all travel a lot, and I think it's important that we let them know that we see them, that we hear them, and that we do appreciate them. Since 9/11, we all know that we have come a long way in terms of, I believe, our preparation, interagency cooperation. We've heard discussion about that, information sharing. But Admiral Lloyd, you said something to the effect that you find little comfort in the fact that we have not been attacked in 20 years. Meaning that we must remain ever vigilant in our efforts to make sure that we are not attacked. And Admiral, you mentioned that you felt there was more work to do in terms of establishing a better link between the TSA and the IC community. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, ma'am. Thanks for your question. My reference was to where we were on 9/11/01 and where we found ourselves 20 years later, and of course that being the purpose of this look back for the committee. And I was only endorsing as a constant the responsibility of both the committee itself as well as the administrator and the people in the executive branch of government to be conscious of and focused on continuing that linkage between the intelligence community writ large and that information from within the intelligence community that can be actionable for TSA. And to the degree we continue to focus on that, we don't let it, we don't assume that we're there. We don't assume that we're going to be there in the future, but rather it's one of those elements of constant focus that we always have on our table, both in the administrator's chair, in the committee's discussions with regard to their responsibilities, and that we just don't begin to take for granted that once we were there, we're going to stay there. This is an evolutionary challenge, just as we heard with regard to the comments about Afghanistan and the resurgence of the Taliban. If that is a opportunity for us to be concerned, we should focus on that in a continuing manner going into the future. And thanks for your thought on that, or your focus.
Well, thank you so much for your response on that. Administrator Pistole, since 9/11, how has the TSA's mission and operations drawn on and contributed to the work of the intelligence community?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. And it's interesting because I'm testifying from the National Intelligence University in Bethesda, where I'm on the Board of Visitors. There is an intelligence collection cycle that is inherent in what TSA does. And I know I was impressed when I came over from the FBI in 2010, become administrator, how robust and informed TSA was in the morning intelligence briefings as it related to transportation issues. TSA was getting the same information that the FBI was, and so is that inherent dependence upon and reliance upon risk-based security. One of the keys is risk-based intelligence driven. So you can't just do things as Admiral Patoski has said, you can't just do it in a vacuum. It is all based on what is the latest intelligence. Is there a non-metallic IED threat out there? Is there a cargo threat out there? Is there a suicide bomber threat or hijackers, whatever it may be? So that's the way TSA starts off every day, is at least when I was there, in terms of having that intelligence informed starts to say, here's where we need to go based on the intelligence.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I can't see the clock. Do I have time for one more question? Administrator Patoski, just very quickly, we know that on the front line with the TSOs are local law enforcement. And I think we've continued to further build a more functional and effective relationship. Could you just talk a little bit about the information sharing working relationship with local law enforcement?
Yes, ma'am. Local law enforcement, absolutely critical to the safety and security of everybody in the airport. They have been wonderful partners with us at airports around the country. Orlando, absolutely included in that from your time there. Local law enforcement is very important now for even more so because we are seeing more disturbances both in flight and in checkpoints. And local law enforcement is right there to make sure that our officers are fully protected and a situation is de-escalated as quickly as it can be. Additionally, as we've talked about, public area security is very, very important. And local law enforcement presence, and sometimes augmented by our own Viper teams from TSA, is really important to just let people know that law enforcement is there, present, roaming around. And if anybody has a situation, they are readily nearby to be able to address it. So I am very, very proud of our partnership with local law enforcement and salute all the law enforcement officers, particularly this week, for their service to our country and to our officers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
LA yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Galvarino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for having this hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses that are here. Bulk of my questions are for Administrator Patoski. One thing, I'm going to submit it to the record. I have a report here by Security Scorecard that they conducted on the pipeline security shortly after the Colonial attack. The report notes that while the cybersecurity posture of pipeline industry as a whole is better than the Fortune 500, there's a wide variance within the industry, with Colonial at the bottom of the list before the breach. I'm going to submit this report to the record and send it with some questions. I hope you can look through it and get me some answers to those questions, because I'm sure you haven't seen the report yet, but I would appreciate it.
Without objection.
Without objection. Yep.
Yes, sir. I'd be happy to look at it and provide some reaction to it. Thank you.
Thank you. So my other questions, though, now are, as you know, the bulk of the TSA's funding and employers are focused on commercial aviation, but TSA has a responsibility for the security of cargo, air cargo, general aviation, mass transit, freight rail, highway infrastructure, pipeline, and ferries. Does TSA have the appropriate funding and employees dedicated to working on pipeline security? And if not, what additional resources or support would you need from Congress to fulfill this responsibility?
Yes, sir. We've increased the size of our pipeline security staff significantly over the past couple of years, and actually the staff of all of our surface transportation security modes. So we are making progress in that regard. Additionally, we have added about 54 cyber professionals, both on the policy side and on the operations side, with that critical cybersecurity expertise that's so important across the entire system, to include aviation and surface. But these are dedicated primarily to surface transportation. Rest assured, we will include in our budget requests any resources that we need. We recognize, of course, that the risk is changing with domestic terrorists now becoming more prominent in our risk profile. And we want to make sure that we do everything we can. The assistance that we provide to the owners and operators of those systems is as robust as possible. So I thank you for your question.
You mentioned domestic terrorists, but it seems when we deal with cybersecurity, most of it is coming from overseas. Is that something you're seeing mostly, though? It's more international,
Yes,
domestic? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Mostly overseas based.
Okay, thank you. And I want to go, TSA has now issued 2 security directives to the pipeline industry following the ransomware attack on Colonial. Can you provide the committee with an update to where things stand? And is the pipeline industry better prepared to defend against future attacks?
Yes, sir. Thank you. The pipeline industry is unquestionably better prepared to respond to future attacks. The first security directive, there's been 100% compliance with the first security directive. The second security directive still has some deadlines that have not yet been achieved in terms of, hey, we got some deadlines in later into 2022. But so far, the dialogue we've had with the owners and operators that are subject to those security directives has been very, very good. And I think we're on a very good path with Security Directive 2. And as has been mentioned, we intend to take what we've learned from both security directives and pipeline and apply it more broadly across the transportation sector.
And you had said, I know you had said before, you are working with CEOs and CISOs of companies, making sure that they are better prepared for these cyber attacks. Has that been receptive across pipeline owners and operators, as well as across the board, I guess?
Yes, sir. Very, very receptive and actually very regular as well. To have, we have regular opportunities to engage to make sure that we're all on track to get the cyber directives fully implemented and also look at other ways that we might provide better cybersecurity overall for the system. Additionally, any CEO knows that if they want to call and talk to me about anything, that's absolutely their privilege to do, and I'd be happy to have those conversations.
I appreciate it. And one final question, just switching, it's not about cyber, but TSA PreCheck. I understand that the TSA has entered into 3 more contracts for TSA PreCheck services. What steps is TSA taking to ensure there is no brand confusion between companies and that all provide these services at an equivalent level of service?
Yes, sir. That is something that we are very, very focused on to make sure that when we do roll out the 2 additional vendors for PreCheck enrollment, that there is no brand confusion there. And we will work with both those vendors as we get through the IT certification process with both of them so that we're well prepared when the rollout time comes.
If you could give me a more detailed answer that later on, I know I'm out of time, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the young lady from California, Ms. Barragan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. TSA Administrator Patoski, if I showed up at the airport today and I didn't have a photo ID, it's true that I might still be able to fly. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
As a matter of fact, isn't it true that on TSA.gov, there's an entire section that says forgot your ID ? It talks about the procedures you may have to go through if you don't have an ID.
Yes, ma'am, and it happens every single day across our system.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that because there is not a different standard. It's not like if you're in the United States, you're a citizen and you show up at the airport, you're going to be denied a flight. But if you're a migrant and you have other paperwork, that you are allowed to board. As a matter of fact, a few months ago, I was at an airport and I assisted a migrant and saw and witnessed firsthand what TSA did in an instance where you had migrants with paperwork from CBP showing that they had been registered at the border and were proceeding on. And I have to tell you, it was a very thorough process. So I want to thank you for the work that the men and women are doing to ensure that our flights are safe. My 2 sisters are flight attendants. There is nobody more important to me than family and making sure we're taking care of those in our skies and the American people. So I want to just say thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about the topic of unruly passengers. Now, last week, a major U.S. carrier proposed creating a centralized database of unruly passengers, ensuring that passengers banned by one airline for hazardous behavior can be treated similarly by other carriers. Let's start with you, TA Administrator Patoski. What is your reaction to this proposal? And if the major carriers, in fact, move forward with this concept, do you see a role for TSA in implementing it?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And before I answer that question, just to you personally, please thank your sisters for the very, very important work they do. as flight attendants. That is a very difficult job. And as we've seen in-flight disturbances go up over time, it's become more difficult over the course of the summer. And so I really appreciate the work that all the flight attendants and all the flight deck crew do each and every day to help keep our systems secure. With respect to the individual carrier no-fly list, I mean, carriers have made a judgment, many of them have, that when passengers refuse to wear masks or they create an in-flight disturbance, that they deny them future flight on their carrier. The challenge here is that the standards carrier to carrier may be somewhat different. And so in terms of, across the system, I personally do not see a role for TSA there. I think that's private sector carrier to private sector carrier in terms of how they want to coordinate what they do and share information. But I would be concerned about the standards that they apply to place somebody on a list. And really, the better terminology for these lists is, no fly means something different to TSA. That means that there's a connection with terrorism when you say no fly in TSA. These are really do not boards, they're denying flight, do not board in the future. But, I know they're going to continue to work on this collaboration across the carriers.
Well, thank you for that. I'm not sure I completely agree. I think it's a safety issue, but I completely understand the response. And just to go around the panel, does anybody else want to comment on their reaction to this proposal? Okay, hearing none, I will move on to the next question. Between March of 2020 and July 2021, there were over 85 physical assaults on TSOs and other 3,600 in-flight disturbances, as you just mentioned, Mr. Administrator. Just last week, there were reports that a passenger choked a flight attendant and attempted to storm the cockpit on a flight from Boston to San Juan. Earlier this summer, news reports highlighted passengers literally biting TSOs. In contrast, there were only 1,230 in-flight disturbances in 2019. What additional actions can TSA take to deter these incidents and fight back against this surge in unruly passengers?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for highlighting that situation. And it makes the job of a TSO ever more difficult when you're subject to an assault. Verbal assaults are bad enough, but physical assaults cross a different threshold. And we have seen an increase in physical assaults in our checkpoints, and certainly in physical assaults and verbal assaults in in-flight instances. Our posture is for every disturbance in a checkpoint, we proceed with a civil penalty action. And that may or may not result in a civil penalty. It depends on what the investigation shows. But in many cases it does. And so we always proceed with a civil penalty action. The FAA controls in-flight disturbances in aircraft. And I know the FAA has been very, very forward-leaning on this. Their fines are quite substantial. And I think they've had some good success.
Boy, I don't know
there.
if my mic's on, Chance. Oh.
And so this is an area of significant concern for us. Finally, to build on what Congresswoman Demings had raised, in a checkpoint, whenever there's a disturbance, local law enforcement will often proceed with a state or local charge against those individuals as well. So it's basically us doing everything we can within our authorities to hold folks that create these disturbances accountable for their actions, and to absolutely include our state and local partners in that operation.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Letourneau, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Director Patoski, I appreciate you being here today, and want to talk about a couple different topics. But first, I understand that TSA plans to replace the aging explosive detection systems for checked baggage with the same type of systems, with the same standards. We know that international airports are already using better systems. Could you talk to me about this and why we aren't upgrading the standards?
Yes, sir. I wouldn't agree that international airports are using better systems across the board. Our goal is to make sure that we are the gold standard for systems that detect threats both in checked baggage and in checkpoints. Part of the upgrade, if you will, is not necessarily a hardware upgrade in these systems. There are some rather significant software upgrades that we have made that improve our detectability in our what we call explosive detection systems for checked bags in airports around the country.
Are there systems out there that are better? You said that you wouldn't agree that that generally they're all better, but are there systems that are better than ours? And I know we want to be the gold standard, but once you are through this process of upgrading, will we be?
We will be, yes, sir. You know, we will continue to upgrade our installed base of technology with software updates. We do that on a regular basis, and we've made some very, very good progress there. And we share that progress also with our international partners because it's in our interest as well as theirs that we all have as close a standard of detection that we can, particularly for flights, obviously, that are destined for the United States.
I appreciate that. As you know well, the linchpin of our security screening system is to make sure that people are who they say they are. How can we better incorporate biometrics into the process, such as in the CAT machines where you put your driver's license, give it to a TSA officer for review? How can we make that better and include biometrics in it?
We're working on just that, sir, to have what we call a one-to-one match, biometric match. So when you insert your driver's license or your passport into the credential authentication technology, what that technology will do in the future is it will pull your image on your credential, digitize that image, and then a camera system will capture an image of you as you're standing in front of the officer. And then the technology compares those digital images together. The match capability is significant. It's much better than if you were doing it visually. And the important thing with this is that is a one-to-one match. It's not a gallery of images. It's the image that's on your credential. And then once the passenger removes their credential, all that image data is erased. So we don't retain any of that information at all because we have no further use for it.
What's the rollout of that going to look like? Will that be available to TSA pre-check people first, or the CBP's global entry or the known crew member programs? If you're working on it, what will that look like, and what's the time frame?
So we've been prototyping it now in several airports across the country. It's worked very, very well. We have a process whenever we prototype. Our process is generally to opt in, so that passengers don't have to affirmatively say, "I want out." They affirmatively say, I want to use that new technology. And then our goal overall is as we introduce new technology.
But with pre-check folks, like those folks have already opted in.
Right.
So that would be the place you're going to start. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and with pre-check now, we are having people provide their facial images upon registration. So we already have that data. So that opt-in has already been done. And what I was going to say is, as we deploy technology, we like to put it first in pre-check.
Okay, all right. Is the pace of hiring for TSA officers keeping up with attrition?
The pace of hiring is keeping up with attrition, but I'm concerned about hiring overall, and I think everybody in the aviation industry is concerned about hiring overall. That's one of the reasons why these pay initiatives are so important, because without a predictable level of pay that's going to increase over time, it's harder and harder to recruit people into the federal government. And it's also harder and harder to retain people in service. And so, to me, it improves our ability to recruit, vastly improves our ability to retain, and fundamentally, it's the right thing to do.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back. We had our membership ask questions, but what I'd like to do to kind of wrap things up is give our witnesses an opportunity to look for the next 20 years for TSA and see what kind of thoughts they might have that they can provide the committee with in terms of what that 20 years under TSA might look like. So Admiral, Joe, I'll start off with you and kind of bring it forward.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think my thinking with regard to the adequacy of both the committee's sort of inventory of concerns and, of course, the administrator's inventory of concerns and making certain that there is a matching effort. And of course, hearings do that. Conversations among members and TSA employees do that as well. But my concerns for the future are just to be consistent with regard to what has been our concerns, and I hate to say it, but over a pretty successful window of these 20 years. And as I indicated in my original testimony, I take no great comfort in the fact that we've been as successful as we've been over 20 years. I just want to make sure that we have the focus and oversight and adequate attention that continues to be vigilant going forward. So my concern would just be to take stock of what happened just now in Afghanistan and see what that evolutionary change to the threat index is and how we need to be compensating for it going forward. So my notion, sir, is that the committee and the administrator looking into the next 20 years has the same vigilance that has proven successful for us as a country in traveling safely and securely for this past 20 years, and making sure that the constancy of focus is never let down.
Pilstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I would summarize my perspective for the next 20 years really within the categories of personnel that we've had some great testimony about today in terms of the importance of supporting the workforce so there's not high attrition, so people aren't looking to go to other agencies or the private sector to get better pay or better benefits. And so I think that personnel investment is critical to helping to continue the professionalization of the workforce. The second is in policies, and that relates to making sure that the administrator and future administrators has those authorities that enable him or her to make sure they can take decisive action in the face of threats and can do that in the interagency arena, not only domestically, but internationally, and the importance of doing that and to be recognized for that authority and that ability. And then third is, as I mentioned, is on technology to make sure that we're not nickel and diming investments in technology that hamper our efforts to provide world-class security in the way that most Americans who travel expect, and frankly, who the world looks to for leadership through international associations such as IATA and others to say, what is the U.S. doing and how are they setting the trends that can make sure that they are providing the world's best security in the most efficient way. So I think those three things would be what I would be looking for as the continued maturation of TSA continues over the next 20 years.
Thank you much. Admiral?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will, of course, echo exactly what my colleagues have said. And let me say, with respect to workforce, as I said in my opening statement, it's one of the best workforces I've ever had the pleasure. And I say that after 34 years of working with a great workforce in the Coast Guard, but the TSA workforce is one of the most professional. We need to support them. We need to pay them adequately, and we need to assure that we can retain them after we do so. And there have been a number of things said to that effect already. With respect to technology, you never have a perfect system, but you can have a better system every day. And it's critical that we invest in the technology refresh and improvement. I think it's also critical that we engage the private sector more effectively when it comes to that. That means getting requirements out, allowing the private sector to help us develop the technologies we need, and maybe looking at the possibility of technology as a service, the way we look at software as a service, so that the private sector can refresh faster than the government will ever be able to, given the challenges with respect to budgets and so forth. So I think that there's opportunity for transforming the way we bring technology to operations on a daily basis. And then finally, with respect to intelligence, TSA is first and foremost an intelligence agency with a very challenging frontline operational mission. And so I would echo that need to maintain that connection to the intelligence that tells us rapidly what we need to foresee for the future. And I would just end by saying, I want to thank you for the support that this committee has had. I think it's critical that TSA and Congress work closely together. And I certainly appreciated the oversight when I was there. I know that sounds odd to say you appreciate congressional oversight, but when I put aside the personal side of it and said, this is about making sure the agency does the right things, you collectively ask the right questions. You dig into the right kinds of issues, and in my experience, you were always, very supportive of the work of the agency. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Administrator?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with what all of my predecessors have mentioned. I would just highlight a couple things. One is intel-based and risk-based operations going forward. It's the core of TSA, as Peter has just mentioned. And I think we need to continue to ensure that we best leverage the resources of the U.S. government overall, the resources of our intelligence community, and best contribute to the development of intelligence in the United States. So I think that's key going forward. The second thing I would emphasize is there will be increased investment in surface transportation security. It's an imperative that the threat is changing, and we just need to get about the business of doing this. We're already on a path, but I predict that will be a continuous evolution over the course of the next several years. Next, I think we need to, rather than replace all our technology at once, we need to have a continuous refresh process for our technology so that we are always at the leading edge. And don't make it easy for somebody to look at our system and try to assess what we can detect and not, because they just won't know what technology they might encounter when they go through our screening processes, or their baggage or their cargo goes through our process. The next is very, very strong partnerships. We have them already. They've been, in my time as the administrator, they have been a significant key to our country's success in providing transportation security. And I would submit also to the success globally, because we are a global leader. We will remain a global leader, and having the private sector deeply involved in that is critically important for us. Finally, I predict that we will have a more and more specialized workforce as technology continues to improve. We continue to hone our procedures. With that will come a more clear career paths for our employees, a greater overall professional development opportunities for them, and greater diversity in our workforce. We have one of the most diverse workforces in the federal government at the entry level and at the front lines of our organization and our screening checkpoints. As you mentioned at the very beginning of this hearing, that is not the case. As you go up through the middle and the upper levels of the agency, we need to fix that, and we need to fix it properly. We have stood up an inclusion action committee. I've established a diversity, equity, and inclusion position that reports directly for me to make sure we have a constant effort in this regard going forward. And sir, I would conclude by thanking you as the chairman. You and I have known each other for a good number of years. Ranking Member Katko and I have known each other for a good number of years. The two of you and the entire committee have been very, very supportive of TSA. You hold us accountable where we need to be held accountable, but you're always there with a solution to help us along. And I greatly appreciate that oversight and your leadership in this regard, sir.
Well, thank you very much. And one of the questions all of us have historically asked every administrator, do you have all the authorities and all the budget that you need to do your job? And somehow all the administrators would come back with, well, if Congress provide us resources, we will use those resources to the best of our ability. You'd never say yes or no. So I guess somewhere there's a training camp for future TSA administrators that you never acknowledge whether you have all the authorities or all the monies you need. You just kind of be able to do it. And I think the ranking member is cognizant of that too. But let me assure you that we are committed to the mission of the agency. We've had excellent administrators. Technology is the way forward and the force multiplier for security. So we absolutely have to get it right. The one thing we did not talk about is how can we expedite procurement so that by the time, as a ranking member will tell you, we got the technology, but by the time we buy it, it's already obsolete. And so we've passed some legislation, but we still need to ramp it up. So let me again thank the current administrator and past administrators for their testimony and our members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Our ranking member, would you want to have a closing comment or something?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say, observing the back and forth today makes me very proud to be part of this committee because it was productive. There was no gotcha questions, and I think we're just trying to make sure we do the proper oversight, but make sure we give you the tools you need to do your job. And that's really our role in Congress. And absent of theatrics today, we did a good job, I think, and all the way around. All the witnesses did, and all the questioners. So I commend everybody on both sides and keep up the good work. And please tell everybody at TSA how proud we are of them, especially the frontline workers. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad the ranking member mentioned that. But in response to the screening and non-resident aliens, the policy that is followed now is a policy that's been in place since we started. So there's not policy of the last 6 months, it's the policy. And so I want this hearing to reflect that there's no special policy right now, it's the policy. And so I want the administrator to reflect that going forward, that his explanation was what the policy is and what it's always has been. So the chair reminds the members that the committee's record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.